What if everything we thought we knew about the birth of civilization was built on a story that started too late? What if the moment we call the beginning was never really the beginning at all, but only the first chapter we happen to preserve? There is a hill in southeastern Turkey, unremarkable from a distance, a limestone ridge rising from the Harran Plain like a shoulder shrugged against the sky. Shepherds have walked its slopes for centuries. Farmers have cleared stones from its surface to make room for crops. The wind moves across it constantly, carrying dust and the smell of wild grasses, the same wind that has moved across this ridge for 12,000 years. And beneath that hill, buried under thousands of tons of deliberately placed rubble and earth, something waits that has no right to exist. Something that arrived 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the Pyramids of Giza, before writing, before the wheel, before pottery, before anything we have ever called civilization. Something built by people who, according to every model of human cultural development ever proposed, should not have been capable of building it. The site is called Göbekli Tepe. In Turkish, the name means pot-belly hill. There is something quietly ironic about that, a name so ordinary wrapped around something so extraordinary. And what it contains, what it has already yielded, and what it still hides beneath its slopes has not merely complicated our understanding of human prehistory. It has quietly dismantled it, the way a single thread pulled from a tapestry can cause the whole image to shift and blur and rearrange itself into something you almost recognize but can no longer claim to fully understand. Before we go any further into this, if you find yourself drawn to the kind of history that refuses to behave, the kind that opens more doors than it closes, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you are listening in the dark somewhere right now, in bed, on the couch, with the lights turned low, drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. There is something I find quietly wonderful about imagining this particular silence stretching across the world. People in different countries, different time zones, all drawn to the same ancient question at the same quiet hour. Now, let us begin. Picture yourself standing on that ridge 12,000 years ago. The wind is the same wind. The limestone is the same limestone. But the world around you is unrecognizable. There are no roads below you, no cities, no fields of grain laid out in neat rows. The Harran Plain stretches in every direction, an endless landscape of rock and scrub, and scattered herds of gazelle moving through the morning light. You are not a farmer. You have never been a farmer. No one you know has ever been a farmer. You move through the landscape the way your parents moved, and their parents before them, following the animals, reading the weather, carrying everything you own. Your world is vast and intimate at the same time, bounded by the horizon, but known in extraordinary detail. Every spring, every migration route, every season of abundance and scarcity, held in memory and passed down in story. And yet here, on this hilltop, something is happening that does not fit the story we have always told about people like you. Dozens of people are moving massive stone pillars across the plateau. Not small stones, not manageable blocks of building material. These are towering T-shaped monoliths, some of them weighing more than 16 tons, the weight of 2 full-grown elephants, the weight of 6 or 7 automobiles stacked together, and the people moving them, have no metal tools, no wheels, no ropes stronger than plant fiber, no domesticated animals to help bear the load. They are doing it with wooden levers and sheer collective will, with knowledge of stone and leverage accumulated over generations, with a purpose so clear and so shared that it overrides every practical objection. They are not just moving the pillars, they are carving them, shaping them with flint tools into forms of startling precision, covering their surfaces with animals rendered in such detail that individual features are visible. The curve of a scorpion's tail, the drape of a vulture's wing, the charge of a wild boar with its tusks prominent and its power unmistakable. And then they are arranging these pillars in perfect circles, sinking them deep into bedrock, creating enclosed spaces that feel deliberately set apart from the ordinary world, spaces that feel, even across 12,000 years of silence, like somewhere you were meant to lower your voice. This is Göbekli Tepe, and it should not exist. That phrase, "it should not exist," is not rhetorical flourish. It is the genuine response of the archaeological community when the full implications of what this site represents began to settle in. Because everything we thought we understood about how civilizations form, about the sequence of developments that leads from nomadic hunter-gatherers to complex societies capable of organizing massive construction projects, that entire framework assumed a particular order. First came agriculture, then came permanent settlements, then came population growth and surplus food and social stratification. Then came specialized labor, people who did not need to spend all their time finding food and could instead dedicate themselves to craft, to administration, to religion. And only then, at the end of that long chain of prerequisites, came monumental architecture, temples, monuments, the physical expression of a society organized enough, wealthy enough, hierarchical enough to direct collective labor towards something that served no immediate practical purpose. Göbekli Tepe reverses that sequence entirely. Here is monumental architecture built by people who had not yet developed agriculture. The temple came before the farm. The sacred space came before the domestic space. The monument came before the city. And that inversion is not a minor footnote in the history of human development. It is a fundamental challenge to the story we have been telling ourselves about who we are and how we became who we are. Consider for a moment how deeply that sequence had embedded itself into our understanding of history. Every textbook written in the 20th century, every university course on the origins of civilization, every documentary ever produced about the ancient world began from the same foundational assumption. Humans developed agriculture, and agriculture made everything else possible. It was the great enabling condition, the prerequisite without which complexity could not emerge. And that assumption was not unreasonable. It was supported by the evidence available at the time. The oldest agricultural sites and the oldest temples and the oldest cities all appeared to cluster in the same periods, the same regions, the same cultural horizons. The sequence seemed confirmed by the record, but the record, it turns out, was incomplete. The record was missing Göbekli Tepe, and Göbekli Tepe changes everything. To understand just how strange this is, you need to understand what the site actually contains. Because the photographs you may have seen, the images of curved stone walls and T-shaped pillars that appear in documentaries and textbooks, those images represent perhaps 5% of the total complex, probably less. Geophysical surveys using ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry have detected at least 20 distinct enclosures buried beneath the hilltop, 20 separate circular structures, each potentially as elaborate as the ones already uncovered. Most of them are still under the earth, waiting. Some will probably never be fully excavated. There are not enough archaeologists, not enough funding, not enough time. The hill keeps its secrets with extraordinary patience. But what has been revealed is extraordinary enough to reshape the conversation about human prehistory. The heart of the excavated site consists of circular and oval enclosures, each built to a similar, but not identical pattern. Imagine standing in the center of one of them. Two massive T-shaped pillars rise before you, facing each other across the enclosed space like silent sentinels. They are the anchors of the structure, the pillars that define the center. Around the perimeter, smaller pillars form a ring, creating an enclosed area perhaps 30 feet across. Between the pillars, low stone walls sometimes fill the gaps, completing the circle, creating a boundary between the space inside and the world outside. The pillars themselves are the real miracle. Carved from the limestone bedrock of the hill itself at quarries located on the slopes just below the summit. Some of them stand more than 16 feet tall, 5 meters of solid stone rising from bedrock floors that were carefully leveled to receive them. The largest weigh between 10 and 15 tons. And these people, these mobile hunter-gatherers, without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals, quarried these monoliths, carved them, transported them, and raised them upright with a precision that remains impressive even by modern standards. The quarries tell part of the story. Workers cut trenches around each pillar, leaving it attached to the bedrock by a narrow base. Then they worked underneath, probably using wooden wedges that expanded when soaked with water, creating enough force to crack the stone free. One unfinished pillar remains in its quarry to this day, still attached to the bedrock, abandoned mid-process for reasons we will never know. It is one of the most haunting objects in all of archaeology, a monument that almost was, frozen in the moment of its own becoming. It tells us how the work began. It does not tell us how they got the finished pillars from quarry to enclosure, how they raised them vertical, how they stabilized them in their precisely carved socket holes. Those secrets belong to the people who carried them, and those people have been gone for 11,000 years. Imagine that unfinished pillar lying in the quarry, half released from the stone that birthed it, its surface already beginning to take the shape that someone intended for it. The rough outline of the T-form visible in the cuts and angles of the surrounding rock. Someone walked away from it. Someone put down their tools and did not return. Perhaps the season ended. Perhaps the community moved on. Perhaps something happened that we will never know about. A death, a drought, a decision made around a fire on a cold night. Whatever the reason, the pillar was left, and it has been waiting ever since. More patient than anything we have ever built. More permanent than any explanation we might offer for its abandonment. But the deepest mystery of Göbekli Tepe is not engineering, it is meaning. Look closely at the pillars and you begin to see something that changes everything about how you understand this place. The T-shaped forms are not abstract architectural elements, they are representations of beings. Look at the carvings on the central pillars of Enclosure D, the most elaborately decorated of the excavated structures. There, carved in low relief on the shafts of the pillars, you can see arms bent at the elbows, hands meeting at the front of the body, fingers rendered in careful detail. Belts are carved around the narrow waist where the shaft meets the crossbar. Sometimes what appear to be garments, kilts, or loincloths are suggested by carved lines. The pillars have bodies, they have arms and hands and clothing, but they have no faces. Never faces. The top of the T, the crossbar, remains blank and featureless, as if the identity of these beings is something that cannot be represented, something beyond the reach of human imagery. They are humanoid, but not quite human. Too tall, too rigid, too perfectly geometric to be portraits of people. Something else. Ancestors, perhaps. Beings from a cosmology we cannot fully reconstruct. Presences important enough to warrant tons of limestone carved in their image, gathered in circles, facing each other across enclosed spaces where perhaps the living came to stand in their presence. Think about what it means to carve a face onto something, and what it means to deliberately leave that face blank. We carve faces onto things we want to humanize, to individualize, to bring into relationship with ourselves. We leave faces blank when we are reaching towards something that exceeds the human, something whose nature cannot be fixed in a single expression, something that must remain open to receive whatever the worshipper brings to it. The faceless beings of Göbekli Tepe are not incomplete. They are deliberately, purposefully, without face. That absence is a statement. It is a theological position carved in stone 12,000 years ago by people who understood in some profound and inarticulate way that the sacred cannot be fully pictured. And then there are the animals, hundreds of them, carved across the surfaces of the pillars and on smaller stone blocks scattered throughout the enclosures. This is where Göbekli Tepe becomes something like a bestiary, a catalogue of the creatures that shared the world with its builders. Foxes appear frequently, carved with such attention to detail that individual tufts of fur are suggested. Snakes coil and twist across stone surfaces, some rendered naturalistically, others stylized into geometric patterns. Wild boars charge with their tusks prominent and their power unmistakable. Cranes stand in profile, long-legged and alert. Vultures spread their wings, sometimes holding what appear to be human heads in their talons. Scorpions curve their tails in readiness. Lions prowl, spiders hang suspended, gazelles leap, bulls lower their horns. Every enclosure contains its own population of carved creatures, sometimes dozens on a single pillar, and they are not random. The same animals appear again and again across the site, suggesting they held symbolic meaning, that they were part of a cosmology rendered in stone, a visual language encoding stories and beliefs we can only partially decode. Some pillars show animals that seem to be interacting, a scorpion positioned above a vulture, a snake approaching a boar. Whether these represent narratives, seasonal cycles, mythological relationships, or something more abstract, we cannot say with certainty. The people who understood this language have been gone for 11,000 years. What we can say is that someone chose which animals to carve and where to carve them. These were deliberate decisions carrying meaning that mattered enough to justify the enormous effort required to execute them. There is one carving in particular that has occupied the attention of researchers more than almost any other. On one of the pillars in Enclosure D, a vulture is depicted with its wings spread wide, and beneath one of those wings, what appears to be a human head, a severed head, round and featureless, held or perhaps delivered by the great bird. This image connects Göbekli Tepe to a tradition of what archaeologists call sky burial, the practice of leaving the dead exposed on elevated platforms or hilltops for vultures to consume, a practice documented in multiple ancient cultures across a wide geographic range. In this tradition, the vulture is not a symbol of death, but of transformation. It is the agent of return, the creature that carries the substance of the dead back into the cycle of the living. The vulture with the human head may not be depicting something terrible. It may be depicting something more sacred, the final journey, the great release. If this kind of question keeps you up at night, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling me which of these carved animals you find most haunting, or whether you have noticed similar symbolic patterns in other ancient sites or texts. There is something about this particular community, people drawn to the same mysteries in the same quiet hours, that feels like its own kind of gathering. And here is the detail that perhaps more than any other transforms Göbekli Tepe from an impressive archaeological site into a genuine philosophical puzzle. The enclosures were not permanent. They were not built and then gradually abandoned as the structures decayed. They were systematically decommissioned. When a generation decided that an enclosure had served its purpose, they buried it completely, deliberately. They organized work parties to haul thousands of tons of dirt and rubble and broken stone tools and animal bones and debris, and they filled the entire structure, covering it from floor to ceiling, leaving no trace of it visible from the surface. Then they built a new enclosure nearby and began the process again. This happened repeatedly over the 1500 years that the site remained active. The oldest structures lie deepest, perfectly preserved by the rubble that covered them. The youngest was still in use when the site was finally abandoned entirely, around 8000 BCE. The fill layers show unmistakable intentionality. It is too uniform, too thorough to be accidental. Someone organized this burial. Someone decided that these sacred spaces, which had taken years to construct, which represented the collective labor of hundreds or perhaps thousands of people, had served their purpose and needed to be put to rest. Why? That question has no certain answer, but it suggests something profound about the relationship these people had with their sacred spaces. Perhaps the enclosures were not meant to be permanent. Perhaps they were conceived as living things with a lifespan, built for a purpose, used for a generation or a century, and then properly concluded. Perhaps the act of burial was itself a ritual, a final ceremony that completed the meaning of the space, rather than erasing it. The buried enclosures were not destroyed. They were preserved, held in the earth, kept safe beneath the hill. Perhaps that was the point. There is a parallel here that is worth noting, even if it is imperfect. Across many ancient traditions, the act of ritual burial, of placing something sacred into the earth, is understood not as an ending, but as a form of keeping. The Egyptians buried their dead with everything they would need for the next life, not to discard those things, but to preserve them in a more permanent form. The Celts placed offerings in bogs and rivers, returning them to the earth and water from which all things come. The builders of Göbekli Tepe may have understood the burial of their enclosures in similar terms. To bury is to protect. To cover is to keep. The earth is the oldest archive, the most reliable keeper of what we place inside it. Now let us step back from the details of the site itself and consider the larger question, the one that has occupied archaeologists and anthropologists and historians since the implications of Göbekli Tepe began to fully register. Who were these people, and how did they do this? The builders of Göbekli Tepe lived in what archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic period, the era just before the development of agriculture and pottery in the Near East. They were hunter-gatherers, people who obtained their food by hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants, rather than cultivating crops or herding domesticated animals. This does not mean they were simple or unsophisticated. The image of the primitive hunter-gatherer barely surviving, too consumed by the struggle for food to develop anything resembling culture or complexity, is a modern prejudice with no basis in the archaeological record. Hunter-gatherers who lived in resource-rich environments, as the people of the northern Fertile Crescent did 12,000 years ago, often had more leisure time than early farmers, not less. They had detailed ecological knowledge accumulated over thousands of years. They had complex social structures, rich ceremonial lives, sophisticated tool technologies. The Harran Plain and the surrounding landscape in the period when Gobekli Tepe was being built was extraordinarily productive. Wild grains grew in dense stands across the slopes. Gazelle and wild cattle and boar were abundant. The rivers ran clear. This was not a landscape of scarcity. It was a landscape of plenty, and the people who lived in it were not struggling to survive. They had time. They had organization. They had evidently vision. What they apparently did not have, or did not yet have, was agriculture. The bones recovered from the fill layers at Göbekli Tepe are overwhelmingly from wild animals: gazelle, wild cattle, wild boar, red deer. There are no cattle bones, no sheep bones, no pig bones from domesticated animals. There is no evidence of cultivated grain in the earliest layers. The people who built these structures were eating what the landscape provided, not what they had planted or herded. And yet they organized themselves to move 16-ton stones and carve them with extraordinary skill and arrange them in precise circles and maintain a sacred site for 1,500 years. The scale of organization required for this is staggering. Estimates of the workforce needed to quarry, transport, and erect the larger pillars at Göbekli Tepe range from several hundred to several thousand people working in coordination. Hunter-gatherer bands typically number between 20 and 50 individuals. Even if we imagine larger aggregations, seasonal gatherings of multiple bands drawn together by the site itself, the logistics of feeding and organizing that many people in one place without agriculture, without stored surplus, represents a challenge that demands explanation. And here is where one of the most compelling theories about Gobekli Tepe comes into play. Perhaps the site did not emerge from a society already organized enough to build it. Perhaps the building of the site created that organization. Perhaps the monument came first, and the social complexity needed to sustain it developed in response to the monument's demands. This is the idea that Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist who excavated the site from 1995 until his death in 2014, returned to again and again. Schmidt argued that Göbekli Tepe was not the product of an already complex society. It was the engine that created complexity. The shared project of building and maintaining the sacred site drew people together. It created reasons to cooperate across band boundaries. It generated the need for coordination and planning and the accumulation of surplus to feed workers. And perhaps, Schmidt suggested, it was the demands of feeding the gatherings at Göbekli Tepe that first drove people to experiment with cultivating wild grains to begin the process that would eventually become agriculture. The temple, in other words, may have come before the farm, not despite the social complexity agriculture supposedly enables, but as the cause of that complexity. The sacred space created the need for the social structures that we have always assumed must precede it. This is a remarkable inversion, and it becomes even more remarkable when you consider what it implies about human motivation. We have always told ourselves that practical necessity drives innovation. Hunger creates the farmer. Danger creates the soldier. Surplus creates the priest. But Göbekli Tepe suggests a different engine, not necessity, but longing, not the pressure of scarcity, but the pull of something beyond the immediate. People did not organize themselves to build this monument because they had to. They organized themselves because something in them reached toward it, because the shared project of creating a sacred space was itself compelling enough to generate the social structures needed to sustain it. Consider what that means. The first great organizing force in human history may not have been the need to eat. It may have been the need to mean something. This is a remarkable inversion, and it becomes even more remarkable when you look at the broader landscape around Göbekli Tepe, because the site does not exist in isolation. In the years since Schmidt began excavating Göbekli Tepe, researchers have looked at the surrounding region with fresh eyes, and what they have found has transformed a single extraordinary site into something even more extraordinary. A landscape, a network, a world. Within a few kilometers of Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists have identified multiple other sites from the same period. Karahan Tepe, discovered in the 1990s but only seriously excavated in recent years, has proven to be comparable in scale and complexity to Göbekli Tepe itself, and in some ways even stranger. The carvings at Karahan Tepe include life-size human figures emerging from stone, their heads carved in 3 dimensions, their expressions eerily present. There are carved phalluses rising from the bedrock in clusters. There are spaces that feel deliberately designed to create specific experiences of enclosure and exposure, darkness and sudden light. Imagine standing in one of those spaces at Karahan Tepe in the particular kind of darkness that exists underground, with stone walls pressing close on every side, and a narrow opening above you through which a shaft of light descends at a precise angle, illuminating a carved face that seems to emerge from the rock itself. That face has been waiting in the dark for 11,000 years, and now for a moment, it is lit. Whatever the builders intended by that arrangement, whatever experience they were trying to create, the experience of standing in that shaft of light before that emerging face must have been extraordinary. must have felt like contact with something that exceeded ordinary understanding. Taştepeler, the broader archaeological project that now encompasses Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and at least a dozen other sites in the region, has revealed that the landscape of southeastern Turkey 12,000 years ago was dotted with these ceremonial complexes. Not one singular achievement, but a pattern, a tradition, a way of relating to the sacred that was shared across a wide geographic area maintained over centuries, expressed through the same symbolic vocabulary of T-shaped pillars and animal carvings and deliberately buried enclosures. This changes everything about how we understand what was happening here. Göbekli Tepe is not an anomaly, a single inexplicable eruption of complexity in an otherwise simple landscape. It is one node in a network, one expression of a broader cultural tradition that we're only beginning to map. And that network, that tradition implies a degree of social organization and cultural coherence across a wide region that we had not previously imagined possible for people of this period. Consider what it means for a symbolic tradition to be maintained across dozens of kilometers and multiple sites over centuries. It means communication. It means shared meaning. It means people traveling between sites, carrying ideas and images and techniques with them. It means something like a shared cosmology, a common understanding of what the carvings mean and why the enclosures are built the way they are built, maintained across a landscape that would have taken days to cross on foot. This is not the picture of isolated bands of hunter-gatherers, each group self-contained and largely cut off from others. This is something more like a civilization of movement, a culture spread across a landscape rather than concentrated in a single place, connected by pilgrimage routes and shared sacred sites and a symbolic language carved in stone. And when you begin to think of it in those terms, the question of what we mean by civilization begins to shift beneath your feet. Perhaps civilization was never really about cities. Perhaps it was always about connection, about the threads of shared meaning that bind people across distance and difference and time. And now, the question of what happened to all of this becomes deeply interesting. Around 8000 BCE, Göbekli Tepe was abandoned. The last enclosures were buried like their predecessors, and the hill was left to the wind and the shepherds and the slow accumulation of time. Agriculture was by this point well established in the region. The first permanent villages were appearing. The world was changing in ways that would eventually produce everything we call civilization. And the tradition of the great T-shaped enclosures, the world of Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites, seems to have faded. Why? We do not know with certainty, but we can speculate carefully about what might have happened. Perhaps the development of agriculture and permanent settlements changed the social structures that had sustained the ceremonial tradition. Perhaps the seasonal gatherings that had drawn people to these hilltop sites became less necessary, less possible as communities became rooted to their fields. Perhaps the cosmology that the T-shaped pillars expressed was gradually replaced by new beliefs more suited to a farming society, new relationships with different animals and different forces. Perhaps the tradition did not so much end as transform, its energy redirected into the temples and shrines of the early agricultural villages that followed. Or perhaps something more abrupt happened. There is evidence in the archaeological record of the broader region for significant climate disruptions around this time. The Younger Dryas, the cold, dry period that preceded the current interglacial, had ended around 10,000 BCE, giving way to the warmer, wetter conditions that made agriculture possible. But the transition was not smooth. There were fluctuations, periods of drought, and instability that would have put pressure on the communities of the region, forcing adaptations, perhaps driving the shift toward cultivated food sources. Perhaps the world that had made Göbekli Tepe possible, the world of abundant wild game and dense stands of wild grain, was changing in ways that made the old patterns of seasonal gathering and monument building no longer sustainable. What we are left with is a silence, a hilltop deliberately buried, a tradition deliberately concluded, a world that vanished so completely that when archaeologists first examined the site in 1963, they thought they were looking at a medieval cemetery. The people who built Göbekli Tepe left no writing. They left no texts that explain their beliefs or their purposes or their reasons for building what they built. They left only the stones, and the stones, for all their extraordinary preservation, can only tell us so much. But let us sit with what they do tell us, because even without the words, even without the explanations, the stones carry a kind of testimony that is worth dwelling in. Imagine the hands that carved the fox on Pillar 27 in Enclosure D. Someone stood before a stone surface 12,000 years ago with a flint tool and carved an animal with such attention and such care that the result is still recognizable, still vivid, still somehow alive after 11 millennia of burial in the dark. That person had an intention. They had an image in their mind of what the fox should look like, what it should convey, what its presence on this pillar, in this enclosure, would mean to the people who gathered here. They had, in other words, an aesthetic sensibility and a symbolic intelligence that is entirely continuous with our own. Think about that continuity for a moment. 12,000 years is a span of time that defeats easy imagination. It is longer than the entire recorded history of human civilization, longer than the oldest writing systems, longer than the oldest cities, longer than everything we have ever called ancient. And yet the fox on that pillar is immediately recognizable, not because foxes have not changed, though they have not changed much, but because the person who carved it was paying attention in exactly the same way that a skilled artist pays attention today. They were looking carefully. They were translating what they saw into what they could make. They were trying to capture something true about the animal in front of them, and they succeeded so completely that the truth of it has survived 12,000 years of darkness and burial and time. This is perhaps the deepest thing Göbekli Tepe tells us, not about the origins of civilization, not about the sequence of social development, but about the nature of the people who lived before the categories we use to organize history. They were not proto-humans fumbling toward complexity. They were fully human, with all the depth and sophistication and capacity for meaning-making that implies. They built a monument that has survived for 12,000 years, not because they were exceptional by the standards of their time, but because they were doing what humans do. They were reaching for something beyond the immediate. They were trying to make the sacred visible. They were trying to leave something that would last. The question of whether Göbekli Tepe represents the world's first city or the world's first temple or simply the oldest surviving example of a tradition that was already ancient when the first stones were laid, is in some ways less interesting than the question it raises about the nature of civilization itself. We have always told the story of civilization as a story of accumulation. More food, more people, more complexity, more organization, more technology, more everything. A story of progress from simple to complex, from primitive to sophisticated, from animal to human in the fullest sense. Göbekli Tepe does not fit that story. It suggests that the capacity for complexity, for organization, for the creation of shared meaning on a monumental scale was present in human communities long before the conditions we assumed were necessary for it. It suggests that what we call civilization may not be a single invention that happened once in one place and then spread, but a recurring expression of something fundamental to human nature, something that emerges whenever the conditions allow it and retreats when they change. Perhaps civilization is not a destination we arrived at after a long journey from simplicity. Perhaps it is something we have always been capable of, something that surfaces and submerges across the long arc of human history, leaving traces in stone and clay and buried rubble for those patient enough to look. And if that is true, then the question of what other traces remain, what other buried complexes lie beneath other ordinary-looking hills in other parts of the world becomes genuinely urgent. The Taş Tepeler project is still in its early stages. The surveys of the broader region are still ongoing. There are hills in the Harran Plain that have not yet been examined with ground-penetrating radar, valleys that have not been walked by archaeologists with trained eyes. The network may be larger than we currently know. The tradition may have extended further, both in space and in time, than the evidence so far allows us to say. And beyond the Harran Plain, beyond southeastern Turkey, there are other anomalies in the archaeological record, other sites that seem too complex for their period, other monuments that arrive before the conditions supposedly required to produce them. The question Göbekli Tepe raises is not just about itself. It is about the entire record, about what else we may have missed, about how many other potbelly hills are out there, their contents still waiting in the dark, their secrets still held by the patient earth. Consider what the deliberate burial of the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe suggests about the people who performed it. They were not abandoning a failed project. They were concluding a successful one. They were performing, perhaps, the final act of a ritual cycle that had begun when the first stone was quarried and placed. The burial was not an ending. It was a completion, and in completing it, they preserved what they had built with extraordinary effectiveness. The enclosures they buried are better preserved than those that were left exposed. The act of covering them, which might look like erasure, was actually a form of keeping. There is something in that paradox that feels worth sitting with. The things we bury to conclude them are sometimes the things that last longest. The knowledge we put to rest sometimes survives better than the knowledge we keep in active use. The archive that closes its doors is sometimes better protected than the one that remains open to every wind and every hand. The people of Göbekli Tepe buried their temples, and in burying them, they kept them. For 12,000 years, the stones waited in the dark, perfectly preserved, holding their carvings intact, their socket holes still precisely cut, their animal reliefs still vivid, waiting for someone to come back, waiting for the hill to give them up. Klaus Schmidt came back, in a sense. He was not the same people. He did not share their language, or their beliefs, or their understanding of what the carvings meant, but he recognized what he was looking at. He stood on that windswept hilltop in October 1994 and saw in the T-shaped stones jutting from the earth something that previous surveyors had missed. He saw that these were not medieval grave markers. He saw that they were something far older and far more significant. And he spent the next 20 years of his life carefully removing the earth that covered them, bringing them back into the light. Schmidt died in 2014, before the full extent of the site was understood, before the Tash Tepe project revealed the broader network of sites, before Karahan Tepe yielded its extraordinary carvings. He knew he had found something world-changing. He did not live to see how deep the change would go. There is something quietly moving about that. A man who devoted 20 years of his life to uncovering a mystery that would outlast him, who brought the stones back into the light, knowing he would never see all of what the light eventually revealed. He is, in that sense, part of the same long chain of effort and intention that began with the people who first quarried those pillars. He did not build the monument, but he continued it. He added his own layer to the long process of making this place known, of pulling it back from the silence it had kept for 11,000 years. The excavations continue. Each season brings new discoveries, new questions, new complications. The ground-penetrating radar surveys continue to reveal the outlines of unexcavated enclosures beneath the hill. The analysis of the animal bones from the fill layers continues to refine our understanding of who came to this site and from how far away. The study of the stone tools continues to map the networks of exchange and movement that connected Göbekli Tepe to the wider world of its time. And the carvings continue to resist full interpretation, yielding partial meanings while holding their deeper significance just out of reach. There are things we know. The site was built by hunter-gatherers beginning around 9600 BCE. It was used for approximately 1500 years. It was deliberately buried in stages. The pillars represent anthropomorphic beings. The animal carvings carry symbolic meaning. The site was part of a broader network of ceremonial complexes in the region. These things are established by the evidence. There are things we suspect but cannot confirm. That the site was a place of seasonal pilgrimage, drawing people from a wide area for ceremonies and feasts. That the demands of feeding those gatherings may have driven early experiments with cultivated plants. That the tradition expressed at Gobekli Tepe represents a coherent cosmology shared across a wide region. That the deliberate burial of enclosures was a ritual act with specific meaning. These things are suggested by the evidence, but not proven by it. And there are things we simply do not know. What the people who built Gobekli Tepe believed, what stories they told about the beings represented by the pillars, what the animal carvings meant, why they chose this particular hilltop, what ceremonies were performed inside the enclosures, what they were hoping for, what they were afraid of, what they understood about the world and their place in it. Those things are gone. They lived in the minds and voices of people who have been dead for 11,000 years, and no stone can hold a thought. The carvings can show us what mattered to them, but not why it mattered. They can show us what they looked at, but not what they saw. And yet, there is something that persists across that gap, something that does not require words or explanations to communicate. When you look at the carving of a fox on a 12,000-year-old pillar, carved with such care and such attention that it still seems to move, still seems to have the particular quality of foxness that makes a fox a fox, you are in contact with something real. The person who made that carving was paying attention to the same world you live in. They were seeing the same animal, feeling the same pull toward making that seeing permanent, toward capturing in stone something that would otherwise pass. They were doing what humans do. They were making meaning. That continuity is not a small thing. It is perhaps the most important thing Göbekli Tepe tells us. Not that civilization is older than we thought, though it is. Not that hunter-gatherers were more sophisticated than we assumed, though they were. But that the impulse to reach beyond the immediate, to build something that will outlast the builder, to gather in shared sacred space and mark the world with meaning. That impulse is not a product of civilization. It is the source of it. The sequence we always told ourselves was wrong. We said, first the farm, then the surplus, then the leisure, then the temple. But Göbekli Tepe says, first the temple, first the gathering, first the shared reaching towards something larger than any single band or family or generation. And from that gathering, from that shared project, came the need for the food to sustain it. And from that need came the farm. And from the farm came everything else. The sacred did not emerge from civilization. Civilization emerged from the sacred. That is a different story, a much older story, and it changes the way you understand not just the past, but the present. Because if the impulse to build sacred spaces, to gather in shared ceremony, to mark the world with meaning, if that impulse is not a late development, but a deep and ancient feature of human nature, then the question of what we are doing when we build our own monuments, our own gathering places, our own shared spaces of meaning becomes more interesting. We are not inventing something new. We are doing something very old. Something that was already ancient when the first T-shaped pillar was raised on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey. We are not the originators of this impulse. We are its inheritors, and the people who gathered on that hilltop 12,000 years ago, who moved stones they had no practical reason to move, and carved animals they had no practical reason to carve, who built something magnificent and then buried it with the same care with which they had built it. Those people were not so different from the people who gather now in their own ways, around their own shared meanings, in their own circles of stone or light or language. The forms change, the impulse does not. I want to ask you something, and I mean this as a genuine question worth sitting with. What hidden history keeps you awake? What is the mystery that surfaces when the room goes quiet, the one that no explanation has ever quite satisfied? Leave it in the comments. This archive is a place for those questions, and the people who carry them deserve to find each other. We are inheritors of a tradition that goes back further than we can see. And somewhere at the beginning of that tradition, or at least at the oldest point we have yet found, there is a hill, a barren limestone ridge rising from the Harran Plain, a wind that has been moving across it for 12,000 years, and beneath the surface, in the careful dark of deliberately placed earth and rubble, a circle of stones, pillars carved with foxes and snakes and vultures, anthropomorphic beings with arms and hands and belts but no faces. A space that was built by people who should not have been able to build it, maintained for 15 centuries, and then carefully, deliberately, reverently put to rest. The hill kept their secret for 11.5 millennia. It gave it up to a German archaeologist who recognized what he was looking at on a windy October afternoon in 1994. And it is still giving it up, slowly, season by season, enclosure by enclosure, carving by carving. The hill is patient. It has been patient for a very long time, and there is still so much it has not yet said. Perhaps that is the most fitting thing about Göbekli Tepe, that it is still mostly hidden, that the 5% we have seen is enough to rewrite the story of human civilization, and the 95% we have not yet seen is still there, waiting, holding whatever it holds in the quiet dark beneath the limestone. The archive is not closed, it is simply not yet fully open, and that is not a cause for frustration. It is a cause for something closer to wonder, because the questions that Göbekli Tepe raises, the ones it has already raised, and the ones it will raise when the remaining enclosures are finally uncovered, are the best kind of questions. Not the kind that make you anxious or unsettled, but the kind that make the world larger, the kind that remind you that the story of humanity is longer and stranger and richer than any single telling of it can capture, the kind that invite you to sit with uncertainty, not as a failure of knowledge, but as an acknowledgement of depth. We do not know what the builders of Göbekli Tepe believed. We do not know what ceremonies they performed in those circular enclosures, what words they spoke in the presence of those tall, featureless beings carved in limestone. We do not know what the fox meant, or what the vulture with a human head in its talons was telling them. We do not know why they chose this particular hill, or what drew them back to it generation after generation for 15 centuries. But we know they came. We know they quarried stone and carved it with extraordinary care and raised it in circles on a wind-swept ridge. We know they gathered here, perhaps in their hundreds, perhaps in their thousands, for reasons that mattered enough to justify the effort. We know they built something meant to last. We know they concluded it with the same deliberateness with which they built it, burying it carefully, completely preserving it in the act of covering it. And we know that 12,000 years later, the stones are still here, still holding their carvings, still arranged in their circles, still waiting to be understood. The memory survived. Whatever else was lost, whatever beliefs and stories and explanations vanished with the people who held them, the stones survived. The fox is still there on Pillar 27. The vultures are still spreading their wings. The tall beings without faces are still standing in their circles, still facing each other across the enclosed space, still keeping whatever vigil they were set to keep. And perhaps that is what they were always meant to do. Not to explain themselves, not to answer our questions, but simply to persist, to be there when we finally came looking to say, without words, without faces, without anything but the weight and permanence of carved stone, we were here. We reached for something. We made it last. The hill in southeastern Turkey is quiet tonight. The wind moves across the limestone ridge the way it has always moved. The excavated enclosures are covered again, protected from the weather and the hands of time by the same principle that preserved them for millennia. The unexcavated enclosures lie deeper in the careful dark, holding their secrets with the patience that only stone possesses. And somewhere beneath all of it, in the deepest and oldest layers, the first enclosure, the one that started it all, still there, still waiting, still keeping faith with the people who built it 12,000 years ago on a barren hilltop with their hands and their wooden levers and their shared vision of something worth making permanent. If this is the kind of history that finds you on a sleepless night, consider sending it to someone who carries the same kind of questions. There is something that happens when two people discover a mystery together, even across different rooms and different time zones, a quiet recognition that these forgotten histories deserve to be remembered, that the people who built something 12,000 years ago deserve to have someone still paying attention. And if you find yourself returning to this one, let it play again on a night when sleep is slow to arrive. The layers have a way of revealing themselves differently each time. The archive is not empty. It is only mostly unread, and the reading, slow and careful and full of wonder, continues. Rest now if you are ready to rest. Let the questions settle into the quiet, the way sediment settles to the bottom of still water. Not erased, but held. The mystery will be here when you return to it. The hill will be there. The stones will be there. They have been waiting 12,000 years. They can wait a little longer. And if the question of what else lies buried beneath the ancient world has taken hold of you tonight, the archive has been inside the Sphinx as well. What Egypt has kept sealed beneath that limestone plateau, and why is a story that runs just as deep and resists explanation just as stubbornly. That one is waiting for you too.